elements dynamically by marking them with the prefix as ATTR. That means now what we have to do is, suppose syntax like this. So public merge count is equal to 2. And here th, I am using call span is equal to merge count. Now this is invalid. So this is invalid because call span is not a property of th, is not a property of th. So call span is an attribute of th. It is not a property of th. So any dynamic value cannot be binded to it. It will not recognize. Then what we have to do is, we have to use the prefix as ATTR. Why? Because the additional attributes related library is specially maintained in Angular. Attribute related library is specially maintained in Angular. Then it uses ATTR dot call span. Now it is fine. It can understand that as an attribute. And it can apply any dynamic value into attributes. Remember, dynamic values cannot be applied to attribute directly. Dynamic values cannot be applied to attributes directly. They have to be applied by using interpolation technique only. By using interpolation technique only. I will show you that point. Now you can see attribute is defined. Now that is working fine. It is merging. It is working fine. Right? That means you have to define as attribute. You have to define as an attribute. So that means you have to configure. You have to configure like this. You have to configure in this way. That will be fine. ATTR call span that you have to do in this way. So technically, if you want to bind any dynamic value, so note important, this is important, is any dynamic value cannot be applied to attributes directly. It requires interpolation or attribute binding. Interpolation or attribute binding. That is one important approach. You can do in this way. What we have to do is, one more new thing is there, I will tell you. Actually, in Angular recent versions, what they have done is, from Angular 7, 8 versions, what they have done is, they integrated this attribute library also into Angular. Earlier, attribute library is separately maintained. They integrated the attribute library also into Angular. That means, so the latest versions of Angular are provided latest versions of Angular are provided with attribute library. So hence you can use the attributes directly. But with Angular reference name. That means, for example, call span is actually HTML HTML attribute, and call span is now HTML is now Angular attribute. That means Angular attribute. Then you can use as property. You can use as property. You can now use as property. That is the difference. That means observe, S is uppercase here. S is uppercase here. Now, important is I removed this attr, then it says I can't bind it. I can't bind because there is no property. But see what I am doing. I am changing this yes to uppercase. Then it is fine. It is working fine. There is no problem in that. And you can see the output, it is working fine. You see the output, it is working fine. Now, many times, so when you are practicing, if I don't tell this point, many times when you are practicing, you will come with this problem. You will say that, sir, you told call span is not a property, but in my computer, call span is working as property. But you will not observe that actually you haven't typed call span. You selected from an IntelliSense given to you. Due to that, you think that you are using directly HTML property, but actually you are not using HTML attribute. You are using an Angular attribute, which can be used as property now. That means this S is uppercase. That means it is not HTML. It is not HTML. It is Angular provided. That means now Angular is providing this facility to the developers so that we can avoid attribute binding in future. In future, attribute binding not required. That means because several elements related attributes are directly provided by this mechanism. They given this or they given an alternative option for that. They provided directives for making HTML more better. What are those directives? We will see that. But what is attribute binding? What is property binding? And what is interpolation? These are the three important things you should know. So interpolation, property binding, and attribute binding. These are the three important things. That means binding a value. Now what you need to recognize, for example, suppose if I am using public photo is equal to some path, some assets tv.jpg. That is the path of a photo. Now here I am using img src is equal to photo. img src is equal to photo. I am getting the path and displaying. Now tell me, is it valid or invalid? We are attaching the path. Tell me, is it valid or invalid? We are dynamically applying to an attribute. Is it valid or invalid? So this approach is valid or invalid? This approach is invalid. It is invalid. Now, for example, I am defining img src is equal to, I am using an expression here, and I say photo. Is it valid or invalid? So this is valid. This is valid because that is the right way to define. img src is given as a property is equal to photo. So this is valid. This is valid. That is how we need to configure the values. that is how